Palestine is the name given by Arabs to an area in the Middle East. It was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire in 1517 and remained under the rule of the Turks until World War I. The Turks were then defeated by the British forces and resulted in parts of the Ottoman Empire being handed over to the French to control, and some parts were handed over to the British. The French mandates over Syria and Lebanon, while the British mandates over Iraq and Palestine. Britain governed Palestine under this League of Nations mandate from 1920 to 1948. To the Arabs, both Christians and Muslims who lived there, it was their homeland and had been promised to them by the Allies through the McMahon Agreement in 1915 for their help in defeating the Turks. The same area of land had also been promised to the Jews in the Balfour Declaration, and after 1920, many Jews began migrating to the area and lived with the far more numerous Arabs already inhabiting the area. Due to the aftermath of the Holocaust in Europe, many countries throughout the world were sympathetic to the plight of the Jews at the expense of the Arabs in Palestine. At the turn of the 20th century, a new Jewish nationalist ideology called Zionism was developing. Zionism called for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This alarms the Palestinians, and violence breaks out between the two groups as Palestinians demand a halt to Jewish immigration and the ban on land sales to Jews in 1939. The focal point of this discontent was Jerusalem because it had a major religious significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations called for the partition of Palestine into two separate nations, Israel for Jews and Palestine for Arabs. However, in 1948, the British mandate over Palestine terminates and Israelis declare their independence as a nation and prevail. The next day, neighboring Arab countries attacked Israel. When the fighting ended in 1949, Israel held territories beyond the boundaries set by the United Nations plan. The rest of the area assigned to the Arab state was occupied by Egypt and Jordan. Egypt held the Gaza Strip and Jordan held the West Bank. More than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were driven out of Israel and became refugees in neighboring Arab countries. Many Palestinians were frustrated that they did not have an internationally recognized leader or entity representing their plight on the world stage, and in 1959, a group of Palestinian refugees working in Kuwait founded Fatah, the Arabic word for opening or conquest. It was led by Yasser Arafat. Meanwhile, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was created by the Arab League in 1964, with a mission to liberate Palestine and support the rights of Palestinians in order to return to their homelands. A full-scale six-day war in 1967 brought about 1 million Palestinian Arabs under Israeli rule as Israel had occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.
When the Israelis invaded Palestine in 1967, I was only 7 years old, but I remember it like it was yesterday. When the Israelis came, everybody had to flee for their lives. My mom and my brother and myself had to go across the river of Jordan to Amman, Jordan as a refugee. We lived in a small little room with other relatives who fled with us.
Before Israel became a state, approximately 1.4 million Arabs lived in Palestine. Only about 150,000 remained after it became a state.
They had to cross the river of Jordan, swim or walk through the river of Jordan.
Changes then occurred within Israel's dominant Jewish population. Palestinians that became a part of the State of Israel were transformed from members of the majority population into a shattered and disorganized minority. Established on the basis of the emergency regulations used by the British during the Palestine Mandate period, the military government enforced a harsh array of travel restrictions on Palestinians living in the Galilee, the Little Triangle, and the Negev. These powers were used to maintain close surveillance of Palestinians for security purposes, to regulate the flow of Palestinian labor to Jewish cities and farms, draw off Palestinian votes for the dominant Labour Party, prevent efforts at independent political activity, avert Palestinians displaced from their villages but still resident in the country from returning to their homes and lands, and facilitate the expropriation of large amounts of Palestinian-owned land. Confiscation of Palestinian land was and still is the single heaviest blow suffered by Palestinians in Israel since the establishment of the state. Discrimination in the division of government grants, loans, water rights, and access to public agricultural land continued. In autumn 1974, the United Nations General Assembly officially recognized the PLO as the representative body for Palestinians and gave it observer status in the United Nations. Palestinian citizens were able to force the authorities to admit to unfair treatment of Palestinian citizens and communities. In March 1977, U.S. President Jimmy Carter acknowledged the right for Palestinians to have a homeland and to participate in peace talks in the Middle East. In December 1988, Arafat announced that the PLO recognized Israel as a state and rejected terrorism. That year, Israel and the PLO held secret meetings in Oslo, Norway that led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority in 1994. In July 2000, the negotiations that the United States hosted between Israel and the Palestinians failed. As part of the efforts to fight Palestinian terrorism, in June 2002, Israel began construction of the West Bank fence along the Green Line border. Many families were torn apart. In November 2007, the Annapolis Conference was held. The conference marked the first time a two-state solution was articulated as the mutually agreed-upon outline for addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On January 3, 2009, the Israeli ground invasion began. The operation resulted in the deaths of more than 1,300 Palestinians. On November 25, 2009, Israel imposed a 10-month construction freeze on all of its settlements in the West Bank. Israel's decision was widely seen as due to the pressure from the Obama administration.
It is also undeniable that the Palestinian people, Muslims and Christians, has suffered in pursuit of a homeland. For more than 60 years, they've endured the pain of dislocation.
In 2012, Mitt Romney paid a visit to Jerusalem and created controversy by calling attention to the struggling Palestinian economy in the West Bank. He compared average incomes there with those in Israel. Israel's per capita GDP, for example, is about $30,000 a year. For Palestinians, it is only $2,000. The violation of two universally recognized rights lies at the root of the plight of the Palestinian people. Number one, the right to self-determination, including the right enshrined in Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And number two, the right to return to one's country. The status of statehood at the United Nations would further the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. The accountability for human rights violations committed within the occupied Palestinian territory would strengthen by allowing Palestine to sign international human rights treaties. Palestinian citizens of Israel lack recognition as a national minority. Not only are they discriminated against in the distribution of state resources, but their political power in the Israeli political system also seems to be decreasing with time. To this day, Palestinians are discriminated against in Israel.
Israel has begun attacking targets in Gaza from
bombarded the Gaza Strip, killing at least 2 Palestinians and wounding several others. Eyewitnesses say Israel is necessary.
Hundreds are dying, thousands are injured and imprisoned.
Coming in, you can see everyone running. This is right now the very safest time.
Refugees who were forcibly expelled from their homes is at the core of Palestine.
Crisis for patients in Gaza. This is part of the same illegal policy that denies them treatment in other countries, that denies students educational opportunity.
A 4-year-old Palestinian boy has been killed in a third successive day of Israeli strikes on Gaza, according to local.
To this day, Palestinians will fight for the rights they are entitled to.